This happened about 20 years ago, and I still think about this creeper from time to time. I was working the overnight shift at a local gas station 7-Eleven, and part of the overnight shift was building the Sunday newspapers. The paper company would deliver stacks of different sections, and we would have to assemble the papers and put them out for sale. We had a little nook set up in the back corner of the store where we would do this. You could clearly see the door from the spot, and we didn't get a lot of traffic in the middle of the night. We had 2 panic buttons in the store. One was mounted under the counter, and a portable one that I always carried in my apron pocket. One evening I'm in the back in the nook, and a guy walks in straight back to me. He's very tall and thin and pale. He's dressed in all black, including a full-length black trench coat. He asked me if I've ever seen anything strange tonight. I'm thinking that he's the strangest thing I've seen in a while. I replied no and asked him if there was anything I could help him with. He then went on to rant about how he's on a mission from God to wipe out all the demons that are walking amongst man. He said he can see people's true forms, and that is why he carries this for protection. As I am simultaneously crapping myself and pressing my pocket panic button, this wacko pulls a cross out of his pocket. It had to be 7 inches long. He then holsters that God is calling him and runs out of the door. A few seconds later, the cops show up and I fill them in. They drove up and down the stretch of road that we were on, but they didn't find anyone on foot. They came back and told me to keep my button close, and they'd check on me periodically. That was one of the longest nights of my life, and I quit shortly after. You see a lot of crazy people working the night shift, but that guy was on a whole nother level of craziness. And I did not want to see that again. For some context, I used to work at this drive-through coffee shop that sells coffee and snacks like bagels and muffins. I live in a relatively small town, 15,000 people, and I've never had anything like this happen to me before, so I was pretty shaken up. I was working alone one night and a creepy middle-aged man drove up, didn't order anything, and then asked if I was alone in the coffee shop. He gave me a bad intuition feeling. It was a Sunday night and I was closing all by myself for the first time ever, being a new hire, and it was getting kinda late and virtually no one was coming through, so I was just doing some closing activities like sweeping and mopping. This is important because we store the mop and the broom in a separate room that can only be accessed by going outside and unlocking the room with a key. So I had the employee entrance door unlocked since I was going in and out constantly. It's starting to get dark and I'm due to leave in about an hour when this old Ford drives up. The driver was an older man, maybe 40 or so. I wasn't too fazed by it though because a lot of people work on oil rigs in my town, and if they're on night shifts they'll stop by for a pickup before making their way on a 3-hour drive out to the rigs. I opened up my window and asked him what he'd like to order. This is where things get weird. He didn't order any coffee or food, no. He just asked me, "Are you working here alone?" I most certainly was working alone, and even both of my managers were no longer in the neighboring pawn shop that they also own. I just felt my blood run cold. Thankfully, I'm smart enough to lie and respond with, "Oh no, my coworker will be back in a second and my manager is coming here in about 5 minutes. He needs to take inventory." At this point, the man looks past me into the shop, directly at the cracked door behind me, and gives me this really creepy smile, before pulling forward and signaling to turn around on the road that goes right next to the open door. As soon as I could no longer see him, I jumped over and slammed the door shut and locked the doorknob and deadbolt. I was so worried to leave the building that night, because I didn't want to walk across the parking lot to my car. I thought he might be there lingering around the area, waiting for me to get off work. I'm so glad that I never told him I was working by myself, because that was the creepiest encounter I've ever experienced in my life. For a bit of context, I work at a gas station in the backwoods of Tennessee, and this is where this took place. Last night when I clocked in the store at 8 p.m., it was completely dead. I figured it was going to be a pretty easy night, because the road the station is on is not the main road. It actually used to be up until about a decade ago, when a new freeway was built. This led basically every business that was up here to pack up and leave, and their old buildings became abandoned. Thanks to this, there are now a lot of abandoned buildings on the stretch of road, and local druggies tend to claim them as their own. Anyways, at around 11 p.m. I only had about an hour left in my shift, so I figured I would actually get some work done instead of sitting around doing nothing. I'm 18 and so I work the shift alone, which is nice because it means I can pretty much do whatever I want. This is normally pretty great because it means I can do whatever I want as long as I get what needs to be done finished. I noticed we were almost out of barbecue chips, and so I needed to go get some from a storage space, which for some weird reason happens to be in the basement of the station. I've always hated going down there. It just gives me the creeps. Why the owner decided to store everything down there is beyond my comprehension. Anyway, I got about halfway down the steps before something fell on the other side of the room and it sounded like footsteps were coming my way. I sprinted up the stairs and locked the door to the basement, panicking like a madman the entire time. When I got back upstairs, I went behind the counter to the storage computer so I could check the security cameras. I flickered over to the one that looks to be inside the basement, and there was this guy just standing there smiling up at the camera. He had a look of absolute insanity in his eyes, but he didn't look like the average junkie in the area. He was clean-shaven and dressed to be in what looked like jeans and a button-up of some kind. Honestly, if he'd walked into the store like that, I wouldn't have batted an eye. But because he was down there, and because of the way he was looking into the camera smiling, it just shook me to my core. I called the store owner, and at first he was so mad that I called him in the middle of the night. But once he heard how freaked out I was, his tone changed. He told me he would be there in 15 minutes, and that I needed to lock the main door to the store and make sure the man didn't go anywhere. I asked if I should call the police, but for some reason he didn't want me to do that just yet. I locked the entrance to the gas station and went back to looking at the man. He was still there, just smiling up at me. About 3 or so minutes of him staring at me later, and he finally walked out of view of the camera. My boss showed up soon after, armed with a shotgun, and when I let him in, he immediately went to the basement. I went with him just because I wanted to feel safe that there was another person there with me, and we ended up finding nothing. My boss ultimately chalked it up to me being tired and hallucinating, but I know what I saw. This has really scared the absolute crap out of me. I'm not sure what to make of the whole incident, but I told my boss that I'm not working night shift ever again, and he told me that that was fine. I've been working at a cinema for almost a year now. I love this job dearly, but some customers, especially at night, are just plain scary. A few months ago, my boss told me and the rest of the crew that we are now playing movies late at night. This means that we would have to stay at the place until around 2 to 3 a.m. Okay, no problem. But my first night shift made me realize what I'd gone into. The last movie started playing, so I started cleaning up and putting things away at around 12 p.m. My coworker, who would bring me new drinks and so on, was sitting with me, but at an angle that you could only see her from my perspective. Anyway, I was almost finished and wanted to take my cash to the register and then get the boss, when this one man comes in. Nothing new. Maybe he wanted to use the bathroom or something. Maybe he was a prospect for the movies. But something about him just didn't seem right. He looked at me after a while and smiled at me. His smile sent a shiver down my spine. It almost looked like a warning. So he starts to look around and comes closer and closer, until he almost has his hands in front of my register. My heart was beating because I was so scared. Suddenly, my coworker sneezed. He froze in his tracks and looked over at her, but he couldn't really see her because of the way she sat. She was almost hidden from him. He looked almost panicked, like he thought I would be alone or something. He looked back at me, nodded, and then smiled again, and almost ran out of this place. My coworker and I looked at each other. This man smelled like danger. I saw him for another 20 to 30 minutes lurking around until he finally vanished. My coworker stayed with me the whole time, besides the fact that she was doing other things on her shift, and it was almost over. I don't know what that man's intentions were, but I know one thing for sure, that they weren't good. One time I used to work the late night shifts at Taco Bell. I was just getting off work, so I headed out to the parking lot towards my car. All of a sudden I heard a bunch of yelling and screaming coming from what I assumed to be a man. He kept shouting "Code Red" and making siren noises. He was obviously super crazy, so I started walking fast to get to my car as soon as possible. Suddenly he spots me, and I spot him. He has a white beard that's so matted it has dreadlocks hanging off it, and it looked like he hadn't bathed in weeks. He started talking to me and asking me if I had somewhere to be. I said yes, and that I was meeting someone at home. He asked if I had a second at least to talk to him because my life might depend on it. I took that as a threat and got on my phone, ready to call the police if I needed to. He got closer, and he smelled absolutely disgusting. He then told me as I was walking to my car that he was warning folks because the government supposedly was planning to take everyone out except the top 1% on a day he called Doomsday. He told me to let him in my car so we could ride off somewhere safe. I politely declined, got in my car and locked it. He banged on the window yelling that I made a grave mistake and that they were going to come for all of us. I quickly drove off and he was still screaming when I left the parking lot. Moving forward, I was always far more cautious on the night shifts.